The stories of best practices have evolved so rapidly that things that were good and poor only a few years ago have changed. The ability to use new information technology, and we saw some beautiful examples, particularly around integrating electric vehicles as dispatchable loads into the grid, opens up this conversation. So I'll talk a little bit about a methodology developed initially to think about global sustainability and their marginal abatement curves, or if you're Swedish, Vattenfall curves, or if you're from the US and international private sector, McKinsey curves. I'll highlight them briefly. And again, there'll be a step towards building knowledge networks to make many of the things we want to see, from off-grid lighting projects to the largest smart grid technologies work. I also want to highlight what we can now do in terms of very fast analysis, modeling of low-carbon systems across scales. And again, end with a plea that the kind of excitement we saw opening the conference, we all leave here with, but we leave here with one or more new friends. And the real opportunities of those partnerships find ways to bring technologies more rapidly to market, and to find ways for think tanks and universities to work with do tanks and make many of these processes work. So let me just highlight a few of these. We've referred a lot to California, but haven't talked a lot about the details. And I'll just pull one story out of many here, and we have Terry Tamminen here who worked on many of these things directly with the governor. But one example is that as part of California's greenhouse gas law, and we did launch our carbon market just a few months ago, there's a requirement that all new homes in California be net zero energy, producing as much as they consume by 2020. There are many companies that know how to do that. There are products called the Powerhouse, and you can find in the Netherlands and elsewhere. This is not uncommon. This is an achievable goal today. 2020 gives us some time to get everyone on board. But this doable goal opened up the conversation with Governor Schwarzenegger to put on equal policy footing a goal that we do not yet know how to do. And that is, by 2030, to have the same goal for office buildings, with a much higher energy demand per square foot, given the floors, data centers, many issues. This is what I would call a stretch goal. When policy is too far ahead of technology and science, we get good pronouncements, but we can't back them up. That might have been one of our flaws in the first push, not the current push, towards the hydrogen highway. If science and technology is developed but not put into practice, we don't get enough draw from the market. So this is an example, in my opinion, of a goal that we cannot achieve yet today, but we know the pathway to get there. All of you who clicked on buildings talked about opportunities where we use 70% of our energy. So this mixture of doable and difficult also puts the clean energy process at the exciting frontier of what legislators, academics, construction companies all want to do. The more of those we can find opportunities to build, the more we can push this whole process to the edge. Let me give an example. In our laboratory, and we heard earlier conversations about some of the modeling work elsewhere, both the European Climate Foundation at UC Davis, colleagues at KTH in Sweden, we built a high-resolution model of the grid system of all of Western North America. Very small time steps going decades in the future, and we wanted to know what mix of generation technologies, deploying new transmission and distribution technologies gets us to where we want to be. So I've plotted here the cost curve getting down to the red dot on the top, and that just says what would it take across 20 Western states in the US, 2 Western Canadian provinces, and Western Mexico to get to a 450 ppm target for the region. Below you see a picture with a carbon curve, and I wouldn't dare say in Washington, D.C. today, we find that at only $70 a ton of CO2, we get there, not by 2050, but by 2030. Because that number is outside of the polite conversation in our national capital, but it's very much in the conversation in many regions that are taking these processes seriously. Of course, what you see is that renewables ramp up, but so does natural gas. And we heard many comments about how to use natural gas to enable and to crowd in renewables and not to crowd them out. And that's going to be one of our challenges for the next decade. The right environmental rules, the right management and investment strategies, so that in a moment of exceptionally cheap natural gas, we don't make the job of renewables and efficiency that much harder. So thinking through these scenarios begins to illustrate how to make that process happen. In fact, our modeling effort, the colors are hopefully self-explanatory. Light blue is wind, dark blue is hydro, yellow is solar, purple is nuclear. This is a map of the power flows that we would get. And the result shouldn't surprise anyone working in the field. What we find is that with realistic build times for transmission, nuclear, solar thermal, gas efficiency, that we could meet those climate goals not by 2050, but by 2030, but only if we're coordinated between the transmission networks we'll need and the generation. If one gets too far on the other, the investment on the other side becomes stranded. So we're seeing high-resolution tools that allow us to think quite differently. And in fact, coming this year, with colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, at Tsinghua University in China, at the Indian Power Authority, and with the East African Power Pool, we anticipate to have versions of this model coming online. And we heard earlier today discussions of some of the large-scale renewables in the southern part of Chile. Our Chile-Peru integrated model will be one of these tools that we're doing everything we can to make as open source, so that everyone can kick the tires, slide the bars for carbon prices, see what would happen if we build enough transmission, if we don't build enough, and we plan that process out. And all of these tools are available on the website of our laboratory. When we think about what's doable, though, do not be hemmed in by old-style thinking on these issues. This is an assessment made in the 90s by a group of energy experts based in Europe. I was one of the culprits in this group at the time, so I'm going to tell a bad story about myself. This was the assessment that we made in the mid-1990s about the growth of photovoltaics. And you can see a fairly uninteresting set of curves. They all show growth in off-grid solar, on-grid solar, for water pumping, for telecommunications. They all have roughly the same curve. You can see we argued each other into a view of mediocrity. What happened, of course, by Japan and Germany and California and elsewhere, finding ways to subsidize and dramatically accelerate the deployment, was that this group of about 200 solar experts who wanted to believe sold the technology short. This is what happened. So this highlights how behind the curve we were, because we thought about this as, let's maximize deployment by taking the systems with the minimum cost per watt. Much of the early solar was not minimum cost per watt. It was integrated programs, the Japanese Sunshine Program that brought along R&D and kept it steady and then ramped up deployment subsidies. When the Japan program, due to its larger economic woes, slowed, Germany and others came along, Spain, Italy, California. This process is what we're going to need to accelerate in this process, and this is where the R20 regions, thinking not just about cities or not just about rural communities, can really find the opportunities to build these things up and capture many of the other benefits. Reduce transmission costs, reduce cost of water. All of these are part of that story. At the other end of the spectrum, we have places where the need is acute, the countries have opportunities. So I highlight a picture, a place where I find one of the most compelling synergies taking place. This is along the White Nile in southern Sudan, a river that has unusually shaped side tributaries, small channels that literally make right-angle bends in the river. Robert Frost, one of my favorite poets, said good fences make good neighbors, but I think we should update that today to say good grids make good neighbors. If you're sharing in energy, in generation, in opportunities through feed-in tariffs or other mechanisms, you're much less likely to disrupt the system. In this situation, South Sudan is now figuring out how to build regional mini-grids, taking advantage of the microhydro in the river to start, building the systems out. And so what we have been working on with the government of South Sudan is not just the fact that I think I'm twice as wide as this poor soldier, but that finding ways to build the industry base, to build out the technologies in the towns, and build the mini grid, the regional grid at the same time. And it's an incredible opportunity to do ecologically sustainable development using run-of-the-river hydro on the side channels, microhydro to anchor systems where we can bring in regional grids and really build out an economic base for a country that's resource rich, but the people are poor. Another example, and we've highlighted it before today, where the innovation process worked much, much faster because of practitioners rushing ahead and research groups finding opportunities, is in Lighting Africa. And Jim Rogers highlighted aspects of this program before. Lighting Africa has been a tremendous success with off-grid lanterns, initially just lights, now cell phone charging, and we heard the example before about the price issues, now small radios, DC refrigerators, many different technologies pulled together. The push has been so rapid that poor quality LED products are now in the market as well. In fact, my most or least favorite in East Africa is the Obama light. It has a very nice picture of President Obama on it, but the light doesn't work at all, and that's very bad for my perspective on things. A need that comes out of this dialogue is for groups to play the role of assessing the quality of products, and indeed the Lighting Africa program has a number of research universities around the world that evaluate and certify certain lights as meeting standards and others as subpar. One of the companies that we rated as subpar sued me. We rated them again 2 years later. Their product has improved. Now they send me a Christmas basket of their lights each year. So it's possible to give a negative message, but encourage positive behavior in moving this process along. An example of the mixture of deployment and analysis also has taken place on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, where training individual families and community groups around the advantages of compact lighting and other technologies. You can see this is already out of date. It's 2 years ago because they're talking about compact fluorescents, not LEDs. So things change rapidly. This community of fishermen on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, working with a number of research students from my university and from the National Engineering University in Nicaragua, performed at the village level the same sort of marginal abatement analysis that has been done by the McKinsey Corporation and many others at the global and the national level. I won't go through the details. For those of you familiar with these curves, marginal abatement curves, you can look it up. For those of you not, it's a worthy point for conversation. But we built out a curve of the opportunities for better meters, installing compact fluorescent lights, biogas, some solar, that instead of planning for what to do in 2030, which is the standard for many of these marginal abatement curves, in 20 months, the community assessed it, received meters from the national utility, and they finished the program. Their village went carbon negative, if you will, and this community now exports the know-how to other communities along the coast in Nicaragua, in Costa Rica, and in Guatemala. They rapidly became a training organization based around this sort of product. And so these curves, again, are familiar with those who look at them. The standard versions are global versions. When I was at the World Bank, and as I see some of the authors here, we worked on national low-carbon curves, Brazil, Pakistan, Poland, this one's for Mexico, and we add to that the same analytic tools at the village level. The ability to train and have experts across scales, from 2,000 people in Nicaragua to the global 7 billion, allows us to have a dialogue between practitioners and researchers around which tools work and which tools don't work. Northern Borneo, the Malaysian state of Sabah, had already purchased a coal-fired power plant to install on the coast in an area they'd also designated as their coral triangle for ecotourism. They asked our group and some NGOs to come in and provide an assessment, and the resources of microhydro, geothermal, biomass waste allowed them to couple that with natural gas to cancel the order for the coal plant. And indeed, now the Malaysian states of Sabah and Sarawak are engaged in a dialogue around, can they spread this model? Sarawak still has plans for very large-scale energy development, Saba is telling a different story. They're having a conversation now at the NGO and the governmental level about which model. So these practices and these methods come from many different opportunities. We've heard many people talk today, from Kande Junkelas to Naki Nakasenovich's talk, about sustainable energy for all. And the sets of objectives of energy access for all and doubling the deployment of renewables and efficiency are ones that only make sense if the technologies and the practices are a menu of options from South Sudan to Austria, from richest to poorest nations. And so one of the features, which I hope you'll all do, is to dig through a bit what's on the Sustainable Energy for All homepages and find the places where companies in the room can really engage, to fund, to question some of the assumptions, and to find where the business story, the excitement that Governor Schwarzenegger laid out, can really be a positive version of how to implement these various versions. I'll close with an assessment area for where our tools are not yet adequate, but the challenge is huge. I wish it wasn't the case that California's current low price of carbon was on the high end. If the ETS, the European price, hadn't dropped so much, I wouldn't say it. But we have a carbon auction now in California. We've had our first run through. Our carbon market right now only covers electricity. In 2015, it will expand to vehicles. We know how to do both of those. We've heard about low carbon electricity. We've heard about electric vehicles, better mass transit. The third part of that equation, where the tools are insufficient, is what are we going to do about the carbon embedded in goods and services? What about the carbon signature of the water? We have places in the US where the same water, at even $10 a ton carbon price, where the water price would have to be twice that in neighboring areas. That is not a situation that will play well in supermarkets and stores. So we've begun to examine the carbon footprint of cities around the world, starting in California and the United States. We've highlighted those signatures, and as all of you, I hope, know, unless you have very sustainable free-range meat, it is a challenging area. My wife is Nigerian, and so meat is central to our diet, and so thinking about opportunities to diversify could be a challenge. But as we think about the tools to analyze it, some of the visual stories are incredible. So what I'll just flip through is today is our release day for some unvarnished data at the national level, down to the level of each zip code in the United States, of the kilowatt hours used per year. And so many of us know, and we tell the story of low carbon as low energy use in the US, in California, but we have pockets of other areas where there's been these important strategies. I'm pointing right now to Duke Energy, and we have the CEO here. The stories of how they evolved their mixture you heard earlier. I hope we've all know the California story because we're very proud of it. But as we begin to look through the different layers, you'll see some remarkable patterns. So if we look at natural gas consumption, we see some remarkable areas where we're going to have to really beat down those signatures. If we look at fuel oil, our Northeast corridor, massive amounts of use. If we look at the amount of energy in our housing stock, we see one part of the story. And if we jump in and look at our transportation signature, it highlights a very different picture. Transportation, goods and services, and I'll bounce back and forth. This is an affluence issue. So our richer communities, often ringing urban cores, are the place where that's high on the equation. And then food. Food production, of which California is quite proud, has some of the highest carbon footprint in the US because of all of the pumped water. And so we produce high-value crops, but we're going to have to recognize that we have a carbon shadow associated with that. But these begin to illustrate. These also allow us to hunt the country for areas that have better practices. Corn grown in parts of Minnesota has a tenth the pumped water of corn in other states because they've found ways to save and to utilize irrigation water runoff. They found ways to capture stormwater and use it efficiently. So these patterns begin to tell us things that are not in the equation today. If I look at carbon dioxide emissions by zip code, we see again the overall pattern. But it's these individual pieces we're going to have to find ways to illustrate, to highlight, and to learn those best practices from. If I zoom in on one final feature, we heard quite a bit early on about the opportunities for cities to teach us a great deal about more efficient systems, largely at this point because of high density dwellings and because of a lack of energy needed for transportation. And here we see an example with New York City. It has a low carbon transportation core because of mass transit, but it has a very large carbon shadow of the suburban affluent commuters coming in. Solving the problem for New York City alone is not sufficient, and the R20 gets us out of that mindset of if you solve the problem just in the core of the city, you solve the issue. This tells the wider version. In fact, if we look at 4 major metropolitan areas, including New York, we see the same pattern. San Francisco, we have low carbon in the core, but we have a commuter beltway. Dallas, Texas, an extreme version. Chicago, the same story. We're going to need to illustrate how critical the issues are to solve these problems by finding ways to visualize, to make it exciting for young students and new companies to come quickly to bring new solutions using information technology, finding opportunities and justifications to invest more, whether it's in the zero-emission vehicles or mass transit. All of these will have to be on that equation. The other feature I'll end with is something that I think 10 years ago I would have been reluctant to do, but 5 years ago I was convinced to host a television show called Ecopolis, to take a whole range of technology options and compete them. A friend of mine described this as a game show for clean energy innovation, where 4 technologies were brought to the table each show, and one had to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. Many of those technologies in our 7-hour, 28-part series have become large-scale technologies today, from not hydroponics, but aeroponics in Singapore, growing plants suspended in air, to green walls in buildings, to IT applications that tell you what's the state of charge in your electric vehicle battery and how close you are this minute to a recharge, and what the cost of the recharge is in that location you'll go to. This process gets exactly what I believe Governor Schwarzenegger was arguing for us to do, to not only be mindful of the climate story, but also to find some of the exciting ways to bring these technologies into action. Thanks very much for the time to kick off the dialogue in this final session.